The other day I was contacted by someone who I think might be our youngest listener. Casper, who is 13 and listens to every episode of the New Statesman podcast, sent me an 104-page Labour manifesto he and his two friends wrote and designed themselves. And yes, Rachel Reeves, if you're listening, it is fully costed. I was really impressed by his commitment, and we had a nice chat, and he sent in a question. He asks, is there a growing need for a new political party in the UK, and how possible is it to win? We've seen Macron's party in France, the Farmers' Party in the Netherlands, and I'm sure there's more. Even with first past the post, can a new party get the support needed and win a decent amount of seats? This is a really good question, and I think a lot of our younger listeners will think, why? Why are we trapped in this strange two-party system? Mm-hmm. And why do, in most of the country, in the safe seats that we're voting in, we have very little influence over the election result? So, Ben, why don't you give us a little summary of why it's so difficult for smaller parties, even the established ones, to break through in this kind of voting system?
During the Brexit wars, we saw a lot of attempts to set up new political parties, and they all got off the ground for about 10 minutes on Twitter, on Facebook, and then they failed very quickly. This is the thing with political parties, and if you don't mind, I'd like to give a little bit of a personal anecdote for some of you who may know. I'm now a borough councillor, majority 1,833, and my ward, the ward that I represent, is 18,000 people, 11,000 voters. And the thing in Chester is we campaign every week. And I was doing 3 days a week door knocking, 2 hours each session. You talk to about, 30, 40, 50 voters, because sometimes the conversations can be long, they can be pretty arduous, pretty hard. Anyway, we gave it a pretty intense campaign, even as well when we had the by-election here as well. And I noticed that, since I became a candidate and once it came to election day, though there were 11,000 voters, we only were able to speak to, I think it was like 4,000 people. So 4,000 out of 11,000, that's not a lot. And by the way, that is actually 4,000 conversations, marking how you're intending to vote, what your passions are, problems, you're going to back me, so on and so forth. And I don't think anyone realizes the reach you need to have to break through to voters, to break through to people, because the turnout in my ward was 30%, and I got 52%. So what's that? I got 15% of the electorate voting for me. That's fine in a local election, but it's not anything to really shout home about. And so yes, reach is absolutely important. If you had an intense campaign, you're only going to reach, about a third to potentially even half of your electorate, because you need the foot soldiers, you need the ground campaign. And you need to also recognize that you could talk to as many people as you want, but what you're used to doing matters more. I'll always remember this, when we were talking about voter ID, we don't know how many people got necessarily turned off from voting, but we do know who got turned away, and we do know who got rejected. And it was running in, I think, the tens of thousands, or maybe just a spot over that. It's all about behavior. What's going to change your behavior, right? If your polling station is changed, if it's in a different direction, if it's a different place, your behavior is going to change. And how many voters are going to be turned off by that? If you've got a new party, how many of you are just going to stick to what you know? Better the devil you know than the devil you don't, really. And that's what I think sort of leads it on. But to be specific about the question, why don't we have another political party? Because there's always an appetite for one. There's this long saying, I don't know who invented it, there's always a party that would hang the pedos, fund the NHS, would always do well. And some people thought, that's just basically BNP policy, right, in 2010, because that's what it was. They were quite economically left, but socially very, very right-wing, to put it mildly. It's not just policies. The Greens like to say, we've got the most popular policies in the country. It is about personality. It is about brand. It is about, do you trust them? Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party instance always pointed to their popular policies, but did voters trust Jeremy Corbyn to implement them without crashing the building down? Very few voters did, and that's why he never really had as much cut through as possible. Now this is a long-winded way of getting around the question, but the truth is you have long-established prejudices in voters in the country that by the way, campaigning won't unpick, because just to reiterate, I only spoke to about a third of my electorate, and brand press game, the press is centred in Westminster. They're centred in SW1. They're centred where, power is, rightly. How are you going to break into that unless you have something that is both top down and ground up? You need like tens of thousands of activists to be ground up, and you need parliamentary backing to be top down. And no one has ever really had that. Change UK had some MPs from the Labour Party, 1 or 2 from the Tories as well, but they had nothing in terms of a ground campaign. Very few activists came over. I think about a dozen councillors went their way. UKIP eventually amassed, I think, 50,000 members. So they had a ground campaign. They know to work some seats, but a lot of it was top down as well. That's why they often underperformed in council elections and parliamentary fights. The Greens, however, are something different. They've got the ground campaign. They don't have a top-down media war. And what you're seeing is poor performances in general elections. Bristol West, for example, soon to be Bristol Central, is very, very green in local elections. But Sangam Debonair has had some stonking majorities in a general, right? The Greens need that top-down media coverage to break through on a national scale. And I suspect that will only come when Labour get into government.
Yeah, especially with the rules of our broadcasters as well. Yeah, so you've got to have a certain amount of representation to earn yourself a certain amount of time, for the BBC to dedicate to you, for example. So it's very difficult to break through into the media ecosystem as well as break through that first past the post system as well.
Yeah, exactly. We have to, first of all, talk about first past the post. That's the key reason. If we look, for instance, 2015, how well UKIP did, they got 3.8 million votes and they ended up with, was it 1 seat, I think? So there's a large disproportionality there, which favours the 2 main parties and makes it extremely difficult for third parties to break through. You saw it the same with the 1983 election when the alliance between the SDP and the Liberal Party led to, I think it was between 20 and 25% of votes, but they only got 23 seats. So there's a huge disparity there, which basically blocks off third parties from entering the House of Commons, and that leads to all of the other benefits, the money, the media attention, the time of Prime Minister's questions, the offices, all of it. If you don't have seats in the House of Commons, it's one of the reasons I think why UKIP and other small parties found it so helpful to have MEPs, because it means you've got people who have a salary, they have offices, they have expenses. It just allows a party to function. And then the other thing worth noting is just the sheer dominance of the 2 major parties of the past 100 years or so. We have to remember that it was in the early 20th century the Liberals and the Conservatives that ruled the roost, and then we had the collapse of the Liberals in the following the First World War and during the 1920s. And then since then, it's been largely the Labour and the Conservative Party. And what they've both done extremely well is co-opt issues that are proffered or seized upon by fringe parties and other groups within society. They're both, as parties, quite broad churches who are able to see where politics is going and move towards that, especially the Conservative Party. You look what David Cameron did in the late noughties about co-opting the Green agenda, about moving towards more socially liberal values. He saw where Tony Blair was and he moved towards that. And similarly in the 2010s, he tried to shut down UKIP and its successes by offering his backbenchers a referendum. So I think both of the 2 main parties are quite aware of the fact that they need to maintain their own position within the political system by co-opting issues and debates that other third parties raise.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true because both of the main parties are broad churches, and that is also a result of first past the post. They have to be coalitions in their own right. And I think that's why some of these centrist, so-called centrist parties that sprung up since Brexit, because before Brexit, you did have a few sort of people trying to make new parties, but they were usually for local issues, things like Cornish independence and other kind of things, whereas these more nationally focused new parties sprung up after Brexit for the kind of homeless centrist voters who felt that they weren't represented by either party. I remember going out campaigning with Renew. You mentioned Renew, Ben, which formed in 2018, I think. And I remember going out on the road with them in Milton Keynes, and just people were just so baffled by who they were. I mean, you could just see that it was just an impossible operation. But the reason why I think that those kind of groups, there was another one, Advance Together, founded after Grenfell, they don't catch on because most of their sort of bugbears are represented somewhere within the major 2 parties, and that is another symptom of first past the post as well. But I think that these smaller groups, these pressure groups, if you like, do have an outsized influence on parties. So you saw, obviously, UKIP with the Brexit referendum is the big example. But look at what happened. I mean, our questioner was asking about international examples. Look at what happened with the Teal candidates in the Australian election, the most recent Australian election, this kind of loosely aligned group of independent kind of community-rooted politicians who were focused on climate. And they were pivotal. I mean, they stood in these safe Liberal Party seats and they won 6 of them, and they changed the conversation around that election in favour of the Labour Party, which did win power. So there is a lesson there, I think, to be learned. Change UK, similarly, I mean, people laughed at them. These were the people who defected from the main parties to form this anti-Brexit kind of group. They did actually really influence Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn was spooked by them. He changed Labour's Brexit line in 2019 to one that supported a second referendum, and that, had huge political consequences.
Yeah, and it's worth re-looking at Brexit and how it ripped apart politics and opened up all these little gaps that new parties could try and fill. I mean, that's why you had the Brexit Party, and that's why it did so well back in 2019 when they had that big surge before the locals and then in the European election that year as well.
Yeah.
And then what you basically saw is those gaps got filled. The Conservatives left the European Union. Keir Starmer's clamped down on speculation about their Europe position. They don't really want to talk about it before the next general election. So it's no longer an issue that third parties can talk about. It's one of the reasons reform is doing so badly, as we've often spoken about. They don't have that unifying, genre-defying issue that Brexit was. They spend lots of their time talking about conspiracy theories and monetary policy reform and immigration and public sector reform. I mean, some of them are important issues, some of them aren't. But they aren't filling a big gap in the market because people aren't looking for something, and they're getting, broadly, I think, what they want from the two main parties.
Yeah, and they're fishing in the same pool as another small party that we have at the moment, the Reclaim Party.
Yeah.
And this is kind of like the UKIP for culture, is how they build themselves, but they are sort of trying to drum up that populist, I mean, I would argue slightly conspiracy-minded sort of section.
Under Lawrence Fox.
Yeah, under Lawrence Fox. And again, you can see that the audience for that is small numerically, but it does sort of have an outsized kind of echo around social media and some of the preoccupations of some politicians on the right of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, and someone we've not mentioned yet is the SNP. The SNP aren't one of the two main parties, but if you look at their influence on UK politics in the past 15 or 20 years or so, it's been massive. They are the ones who secured a referendum back in 2014. Just thinking about that and thinking about devolution in general, there are other opportunities for parties that aren't the two big ones to come forward. And then also we must mention Northern Ireland and the disparate group of parties there. So there are opportunities for smaller parties to get into office and actually hold proper power.
And Alba too, as well, in Scotland. I mean, another pro-independence party, Alex Salmond, a very big figure, they've managed to rattle the SNP establishment with their different line on gender recognition, on a stronger line on pushing for a referendum. They had, a bit of an influence in that leadership contest, sticking their oar in. Suggesting to the SNP that they unite ahead of the next election. So, these parties, even though they may remain small, they can have an influence on leaders' decisions. Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.